Fantasies are okay, right? Completely normal. For a family man with a mundane existence, life was fine, in a plain, uneventful type of way. He didn't mind the appearance of his outwardly boring existence because that facade served him well and kept his fantasies out of sight and concealed enough not to be found out. This seemingly ordinary life helped to keep the internal rotten vein running through him a secret. But what would happen when Robert Leroy Anderson shared his deep, dark, and vile secret? Welcome to 10-Minute Murder, brief and bingeable true crime. I'm Joe, the host, and thank you for joining today. I really appreciate it. And I appreciate it more than I can explain with mouth words, so I'm not even going to attempt. Just know that me gusta that a lot. Joe, you sound so natural. Are you fluent in Spanish? No, I'm not. As hard as it is to believe after hearing that, not to flex on anybody, but I was the treasurer of our high school Spanish club for 2 years in a row, though. Okay, before we jump into the meat and potatoes of today's story, make sure you are subscribed to 10-Minute Murder if you're a new listener. If you are an OG listener and you're not subscribed, I don't know how you're doing it. Are you typing it in every time to go and find it? That make your life easier. Just subscribe, and there's the podcast every single time you open the app. New episodes, boom, right there in your face. Also, connect on social media to get updates and see visuals that go along with what you're hearing on the podcast. Nothing gross and graphic, but I post it all there. Okay, now to today's story. Robert Leroy Anderson was born in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. He was married a couple of times, and his second wife, Elaine, he had 3 kids with her, lived in a mobile home park, and worked for the local meat packing plant. An exceptionally unremarkable life, or so it seemed. But if you watch Dexter, even though he's a TV character and is not a real person, you know that it's in the best interest of someone with a monster living inside them to keep it hidden. Around 1994, Robert began to have thoughts, fantasies, really. Sexual fantasies abnormal to even those located on the outermost reaches of the completely unacceptable. Robert's fantasies were of kidnapping, raping, and murdering women. And if you thought that Robert kept those dark fantasies to himself, you'd be wrong. Robert actually shared his ongoing fantasies with his trusted best friend, Glenn Walker. And as luck would have it, Glenn had the same exact type of fantasies too. A couple of sickos. And as kindred spirits do, when they find that they have the same interests, Robert and Glenn, they began to talk more about their fantasies, which led them closer and closer to making them a reality. They focused on the planning and the prepping to carry it all out. But the most important ingredient of their plan, their first victim. On August 22nd, 1994, Larissa Domaski was finishing up her shift at the meat packing plant at around 1 a.m. and left work shortly thereafter. By 8:40 a.m., Larissa's husband was waking up and realizing that Larissa had never made it home. After checking around, he called the local police department and officially reported her missing. Investigators started their search at the last known place that Larissa was seen, which was the parking lot of the meat packing plant. They located Larissa's van in the parking lot and uncovered an unsettling clue immediately. Larissa's keys were still hanging in the door of the vehicle. Her car also had a flat tire. But Larissa, she was nowhere to be seen. A search was organized, a monetary reward was offered, and still, it was as if Larissa had disappeared into thin air or was abducted by aliens. But Larissa had not been abducted by aliens. That would have actually been preferable to what did happen. She had instead disappeared into the clutches of Robert and Glenn as they confronted Larissa in the parking lot of the meat packing plant, held a knife to her throat, and physically dragged her to their vehicle. Robert and Glenn drove Larissa to a nearby lake, raped and murdered her by wrapping duct tape around her face and head until she suffocated to death. When Robert and Glenn had finished fulfilling their disgusting fantasy for the first time, they buried Larissa under a bush and left the scene. And if you thought that the fantasy was complete and Robert and Glenn's twisted, deadly kinks were fulfilled, absolutely not. They instead started planning their next fantasy kill just a few months later. On November 10, 1994, Robert and Glenn carried out their plan to rape and murder Amy Anderson. But something went wrong. Or actually right, depending on the perspective. Amy was pulled over on the side of the road, just as Robert and Glenn had planned. With a flat tire they had caused, they pulled up to help Amy. She had her trunk open, and Robert approached. As Amy turned to continue to try to get the jack out of her trunk, Robert lunged at her. He grabbed Amy around the waist and tried to pull her towards the nearby ditch, but Amy grabbed the edge of the trunk. Robert's momentum of trying to pull her away caused him to fall into the ditch by himself, and he lost his grip on Amy. She frantically ran away from her car and Robert and flagged down a passing car and was able to miraculously get away from her abductors. After this botched kidnapping and murder attempt, Robert and Glenn took a break. Robert was a bit busy having his third child, and years passed, but the dark and deadly fantasies never quite went away. In 1996, Robert had found a new victim, all for himself: Piper Striley. Piper lived with Vance, her husband, along with their kids, in a trailer located on 40 acres outside of Sioux Falls. The Strileys were working towards their dream of hosting their own Bible camp for children on their land. And it was the guise of inquiring about this Bible camp that Robert used to step into the lives of the Striley family. On July 27, 1996, a chubby, balding stranger in his mid-20s appeared on their property. He said his name was Rob Anderson, and Vance Striley described him later as, quote, an affable guy who had a limp handshake. Robert had driven up in a black Ford Bronco at about 7:30 a.m. He seemed surprised that Vance Striley was home and mumbled something about having driven by the house several times over the past few months, as he mentioned enrolling his children in that Bible camp. Vance told him that the Bible camp was closed for the year, but they would be glad to add his name to the list for 1997. Piper wrote his name and phone number on a piece of paper, and Robert left. 2 days later, on July 29, 1996, Vance drove to his plumbing job as usual, while Piper, who was running a little bit late, called her babysitter at 9:20 to say that they were on their way. But before she could leave with her 2 kids, Robert reappeared. With the Striley children as the only living witnesses to this moment, they looked on from a hiding place as Robert grabbed Piper and handcuffed her. He then retrieved the note with his name and phone number written down to cover his tracks. He also grabbed the blue tent that was a birthday present for Piper's son and dragged Piper out to his vehicle. Robert then drove to a secluded area where he sexually assaulted, murdered, and disposed of Piper's body. Robert then returned to the Striley residence when he realized that he had lost his watch during the struggle, and he found it. It was during that time when he found his watch that he was seen by the Striley's neighbor, who saw him walk from the house back to his car. When Piper failed to arrive at the daycare or at her job, her husband called home but nobody picked up. Later, when an employee of the daycare called to check on Piper, her daughter answered the phone call. "I don't want my mommy to die. I don't want my daddy to die," Shayna screamed into the phone. "They're probably killed." The sheriff's department was notified immediately, and when deputies arrived at the Striley's home, a visible struggle was confirmed to have taken place, and Piper was obviously gone. When investigators interviewed Piper's daughter, she reported that, quote, a mean man driving a black vehicle with black wheels came into the trailer and took their mother away. "She's not coming back," Shayna told the investigators. And she was right, but Piper's killer would be found. During the ensuing investigation, they were able to piece together enough leads and evidence to reveal the suspect as Robert Leroy Anderson, and subsequently arrested him in the parking lot of the meat packing plant. In the end, and through a thorough investigation, Robert Leroy Anderson was found guilty of kidnapping Piper Striley and was sentenced to life in prison on May 8, 1997. Piper's body has never been found, though, and to this day, prosecutors have vowed that there would be another day of reckoning. Sooner or later, Robert Leroy Anderson will face that homicide charge. That's today's 10-minute murder. Brief and bingeable true crime. Thank you for listening today, and as I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, if you are new to listening to this podcast, be sure that before you go, you hit subscribe wherever you're listening right now, whatever app you're listening on, whatever webpage, any place that you're listening on. Make sure that you subscribe so that you don't miss any future episodes of 10 Minute Murder. And it's easier if you want to go back and listen to any of the 200 plus episodes of the backstories. Those are available to you there as well. If you only listen on YouTube, not all of the episodes are available there. Just find literally any podcast app, and all of the episodes will be there. In the show notes of this episode, you'll find links to where you can connect with 10 Minute Murder on social media. Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. I post the visuals that go along with the episodes. Plus, I post different things, like different things that are going on with true crime in the world. I post that mostly on Facebook. So if you want to check that out, links are in the show notes of this episode, or just as easily, you can type 10 Minute Murder into the search bar, and it's going to pop right up. Thank you for listening to 10 Minute Murder. Be safe and make good choices.